War has shaped the course of human history, but some battles stand out not for victory or strategy, rather, for the sheer scale of destruction, suffering, and loss that they unleashed. These are not just stories of armies clashing or borders shifting. They are moments where human lives were consumed in staggering numbers, where entire landscapes were scarred beyond recognition, and where the consequences echoed for generations. Today we're exploring 6 of the worst war battles in history. Events that reveal just how devastating conflict can become when it spirals beyond control. This isn't about glorifying war, and it's not about celebrating victory. It's about understanding the cost and remembering the lives behind the numbers. We begin in July of 1863, during the American Civil War, at a place that would forever be etched into history, Gettysburg. Over the course of just 3 days, 2 massive armies collided in what would become the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. But to truly understand how devastating this battle was, you have to imagine the scale of it. These weren't small scattered skirmishes. Tens of thousands of soldiers stood facing each other across open fields, armed with rifles, artillery, and determination. When the fighting began, it was relentless. Wave after wave of soldiers advanced under heavy fire, many knowing full well they might not survive the charge. One of the most infamous moments came during Pickett's charge, when Confederate forces marched nearly a mile across open ground, directly into Union defenses. It was a near-suicidal assault, as cannon fire tore through their ranks, and bullets rained down. Entire lines of soldiers fell within minutes. By the time the battle ended, over 50,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. That number is almost impossible to comprehend. Entire communities lost fathers, sons, and brothers in just a few days. Even for those who survived, the trauma lingered long after the smoke cleared. The fields of Gettysburg became a symbol, not just of a turning point in the war, but of the immense human cost of a nation divided against itself. But as devastating as Gettysburg was, it would be overshadowed just decades later by a new kind of warfare, one fueled by industrial power and modern technology. In 1916, during the First World War, the Battle of the Somme began. What followed was months of relentless fighting that would come to define the horrors of trench warfare. On the very first day alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. Just think about that. Tens of thousands of lives changed forever. In a single morning, soldiers climbed out of their trenches and advanced across what was known as No Man's Land, a barren stretch of earth littered with barbed wire, craters, and the bodies of those who had fallen before them. They were met with machine gun fire so intense that entire units were wiped out before they even reached the enemy lines. And yet the battle didn't end there. It dragged on for over 4 months. Day after day, soldiers endured mud, rain, disease, and constant bombardment. The ground itself seemed to swallow men whole. Progress was measured in yards, not miles, and every inch gained came at a terrible price. By the end of the Somme, more than 1 million soldiers had been killed or wounded. The scale of destruction was unlike anything the world had seen before. It wasn't just a battle. It was a grim demonstration of how modern warfare could turn human lives into numbers on a staggering scale. If we go back even further in time, long before guns and artillery, we find another battle that stands out for its sheer brutality. Cannae fought in 216 BC. This was a clash between the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian forces led by the brilliant General Hannibal. The Romans fielded one of the largest armies they had ever assembled, confident that their sheer numbers would overwhelm their enemy. But what followed was one of the most devastating defeats in military history. Hannibal executed a strategy so effective that it is still studied to this day. He allowed the Roman forces to push into the center of his line, gradually surrounding them from both sides. As the trap closed, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers found themselves packed tightly together, unable to move, unable to escape. The battlefield became a suffocating mass of humanity. Soldiers were crushed, trampled, and cut down where they stood. There was no room to fight, no space to flee. By the end of the day, an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 Romans had been killed. Imagine the chaos, the noise, the fear, the realization that there was no way out. Cannae wasn't just a defeat. It was a catastrophe that shook the Roman Republic. to its core, and while it demonstrated the power of strategy and leadership, it also revealed just how quickly a battle could turn into a slaughter. Centuries later, the world would once again witness a battle, defined not by quick victory, but by prolonged suffering. The Battle of Verdun, fought in 1916, lasted nearly 10 months. 10 months of constant fighting, shelling, and death. The goal wasn't necessarily to win quickly. It was to wear the enemy down, to force them into a war of attrition, where survival itself became the challenge. Soldiers rotated in and out of the front lines, but for many, there was no escape. The conditions were beyond harsh. Artillery fire was constant, turning the landscape into a wasteland of mud and craters. Entire forests were reduced to splintered stumps. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and the sound of explosions that never seemed to stop. Over time, the psychological toll became just as devastating as the physical one. Soldiers lived with the constant fear that any moment could be their last. By the time the battle finally ended, over 700,000 casualties had been recorded. That's nearly 750,000 lives, lost or forever changed. In a single, drawn-out struggle, Verdun became a symbol of endurance, but also of the horrifying cost of a war where neither side was willing or able to back down. As we move into the Second World War, the scale of destruction grows even larger. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between 1942 and 1943, transformed an entire city into a battlefield. This wasn't a fight over open fields or distant trenches. This was urban warfare at its most brutal. Every building, every street, every room became a potential battleground. Soldiers fought at incredibly close range, sometimes just meters apart. Civilians were caught in the middle, trapped in a city that was being systematically destroyed. Food became scarce. Temperatures dropped to freezing levels. Survival itself became a daily struggle. The fighting was relentless, with both sides refusing to give ground. Entire units were sent into battle, knowing they might never return. And yet they kept coming. By the end of the battle, an estimated 2 million people had been killed, wounded or captured. That number is almost beyond comprehension. Stalingrad wasn't just a military engagement. It was a human catastrophe on a massive scale. And while it marked a turning point in the war, it did so at a cost that is difficult to put into words. Finally, we come to Okinawa in 1945, one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. What makes this battle especially tragic is not just the intensity of the fighting, but the impact on civilians. As Allied forces landed on the island, they were met with fierce resistance. The Japanese defenders were deeply entrenched, using caves, tunnels, and fortified positions to slow the advance. The battle quickly turned into a brutal struggle, with heavy bombardment from land, sea, and air. Kamikaze attacks targeted ships, while ground forces engaged in close, desperate combat. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Okinawa was the toll on the civilian population. Hundreds of thousands of people were caught in the middle of the fighting. Many were forced to flee their homes, seeking shelter wherever they could. Others were driven into impossible situations, facing fear, confusion, and unimaginable hardship. By the time the battle ended, over 200,000 people had lost their lives, including a massive number of civilians. Entire communities were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Okinawa became a stark reminder that in war it is often the innocent who suffer the most. When we look back at these battles, Gettysburg, the Somme, Cannae, Verdun, Stalingrad, and Okinawa, it's easy to focus on the numbers, the strategies, the outcomes. But behind every statistic is a human story, a life that was lived, a future that was lost, a family that was changed forever. These battles remind us that war is not just a series of events in a history book. It is a reality that has shaped and scarred the world we live in today. And while history cannot be changed, it can be remembered, because in remembering these moments, we acknowledge the cost, and perhaps in doing so, we take one small step toward ensuring that such devastation is never repeated.